Since the war in Ukraine began, Europe has been divided, not on whether Ukraine should be supported, but on how that support should be handled. While many European nations have stood firmly with Ukraine, sending financial aid and military support, not all of them agree with the way the United States has approached the conflict. Some countries believe that Washington's involvement is making the situation worse, prolonging the war instead of finding diplomatic solutions. Others feel that the economic consequences of following U.S. policies, particularly regarding sanctions on Russia, have hurt Europe far more than America. Despite backing Ukraine, these 5 countries have been openly critical of U.S. strategies, insisting that Europe must make its own decisions rather than blindly following Washington's lead. Our first country is Hungary. Hungary's position on the war has been one of the most controversial in Europe. Prime Minister Viktor Orban has maintained a firm stance that while Ukraine deserves support, Hungary will not participate in actions that could further escalate the conflict. The Hungarian government has refused to send weapons to Ukraine, despite pressure from both the European Union and NATO. Instead, it has focused on humanitarian aid, assisting Ukrainian refugees and providing medical supplies. However, Hungary has repeatedly blocked and delayed EU sanctions on Russia, arguing that these measures harm European economies more than they impact Moscow. Orban has openly criticized the United States for pressuring Europe into economic policies that he believes are self-destructive. Hungary, like many European nations, was highly dependent on Russian energy before the war. After the invasion, Washington pushed for a complete break from Russian oil and gas, but Hungary resisted. Orban's government secured long-term energy deals with Moscow, prioritizing Hungary's economic stability over political pressure from the West. His argument is simple: Europe cannot afford to blindly follow American decisions that may not be in its best interest. Despite criticism from other European leaders, Hungary has remained steadfast in its position, arguing that peace should be prioritized over military escalation. Number 2. France. France has been one of Ukraine's strongest supporters, supplying financial aid and weapons, but it has also been clear that it does not always agree with the United States. French President Emmanuel Macron has repeatedly stressed that Europe must have its own strategic autonomy, meaning it should not rely on Washington to dictate its foreign policy. Unlike some of its European neighbors, France has maintained diplomatic relations with Russia throughout the conflict, with Macron engaging in multiple phone calls and discussions with Vladimir Putin. While these efforts have not led to a resolution, they highlight France's belief that diplomacy should not be abandoned, even in times of war. Macron has also criticized the idea that Europe should be completely dependent on American military support. France has long pushed for an independent European defense system, arguing that the continent should not always rely on NATO, which is heavily influenced by the United States. Additionally, many in France believe that the sanctions imposed on Russia, largely influenced by U.S. policy, have hurt European economies more than they have affected Moscow. Energy prices skyrocketed across Europe after these sanctions were put in place, while the U.S. benefited by selling more of its liquefied natural gas to European nations. Macron's government has been increasingly vocal about the need for Europe to make decisions based on its own interests rather than automatically siding with Washington. Number 3. Germany. Germany's stance on the war has been one of reluctant support for Ukraine, largely due to its complex relationship with both Russia and the United States. While Berlin has provided Ukraine with financial assistance and weapons, it has often hesitated when pressured by Washington to escalate its military involvement. One of the biggest points of contention between Germany and the US has been energy policy. Before the war, Germany was heavily dependent on Russian natural gas, but after the invasion, the US pushed for a complete severing of energy ties with Moscow. This led to one of the worst energy crises in modern German history, with soaring costs for both businesses and households. Many Germans feel that while the United States encouraged Europe to cut off Russian energy, American energy companies ultimately profited by selling more expensive alternatives to European nations. Germany has also been cautious about sending heavy weaponry to Ukraine, often delaying major decisions due to concerns about further escalating the conflict. Chancellor Olaf Scholz initially resisted sending German-made Leopard tanks to Ukraine, only agreeing after intense pressure from the US and other NATO allies. Even then, Berlin remained uneasy, with many German politicians warning that sending advanced weaponry could provoke Russia into more drastic actions. While Germany continues to support Ukraine, there is a growing belief that Europe should not automatically follow Washington's lead, especially when it comes to decisions that have long-term consequences for European security and stability. Number 4. Austria. Austria has taken a unique approach to the Ukraine war, balancing its condemnation of Russia's invasion with its long-standing policy of neutrality. While Austria has supported Ukraine through humanitarian aid and European Union sanctions against Russia, it has refused to send weapons or participate in military actions. This decision is rooted in Austria's 1955 neutrality policy, which prohibits it from joining military alliances or engaging in armed conflicts. Even as European nations deepen their military support for Ukraine, Austria remains committed to its neutral stance. The United States has encouraged European allies to provide stronger military assistance to Ukraine, seeing it as essential to countering Russian aggression. Austria, however, has resisted this pressure, arguing that neutrality is key to maintaining stability. Despite this, Austria has not ignored Ukraine's plight. It has provided financial aid, medical supplies, and shelter for thousands of refugees. Austrian officials believe this support aligns with their values and is equally important as military aid. Economic concerns have also shaped Austria's position. The country was heavily dependent on Russian energy before the war, and the sudden shift away from Russian oil and gas, pushed by the US, has caused economic strain. Many Austrian business leaders worry that while sanctions are intended to weaken Russia, they are also hurting European economies. This has led to growing debate over whether Europe should fully align with American policies or adopt a more independent approach. Austria's stance has led to tensions with Washington, where officials argue that stronger military action is necessary to stop Russia. However, Austria remains firm, insisting that breaking neutrality would set a dangerous precedent. Instead, Vienna focuses on diplomacy, keeping dialogue open with Russia while supporting Ukraine's sovereignty. Despite these differences, Austria and the US continue to cooperate on global issues like trade, security, and counterterrorism. Austria's position reflects a broader debate in Europe. Should the continent continue relying on American leadership, or should it develop a more independent foreign policy? While Austria supports Ukraine, it also believes that peace cannot be achieved through military means alone. Our last country is Italy. Italy has been a firm supporter of Ukraine, providing financial aid and military assistance, but it has also been cautious about how deeply it should involve itself in the conflict. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has expressed strong backing for Ukraine on the international stage, but there is a significant divide within Italy over how the war should be handled. Many Italian politicians and citizens believe that Europe is being dragged into a prolonged conflict that could have devastating consequences for the continent. One of the biggest concerns in Italy is the economic impact of the war and the sanctions imposed on Russia. Like many European nations, Italy has faced rising energy costs and economic uncertainty as a result of these sanctions. While the US has encouraged European nations to take a hard stance against Russia, some Italians believe that Washington is less affected by these policies than Europe. There is also growing skepticism about the long-term consequences of NATO's increasing involvement in the conflict. Some Italian leaders have warned that continuing to escalate military support could push Europe closer to a direct confrontation with Russia, a scenario that many want to avoid at all costs. As the war continues, Italy's position reflects the broader concerns within Europe. How much involvement is too much, and at what point should diplomacy take priority over military aid? While Italy remains committed to supporting Ukraine, it is also questioning whether Europe should continue following Washington's lead, without considering its own long-term interests. The war in Ukraine has created deep divisions within Europe, not over whether Ukraine should be supported, but over how that support should be handled. While Hungary, France, Germany, Austria, and Italy all back Ukraine's independence, they are also pushing back against American policies that they believe are harming Europe. Whether it's concerns over economic consequences, military escalation, or the need for diplomatic solutions, these nations are proving that Europe is not simply following Washington's lead. As the conflict continues, the question remains: should Europe continue down the path set by the United States, or should it take a different approach, one that prioritizes its own stability and security?